America's most senior counterterrorism official just resigned, not because he was fired, not because of a scandal, because he read all the intelligence on the Iran war, every classified document, every threat assessment, every intercepted communication, and he concluded that the entire justification for this war was a lie. And then he said so, publicly, with his name on it. That changes everything. His name is Joe Kent. Until March 17th, 2026, he was the director of the National Counterterrorism Center, the single most senior counterterrorism position in the entire United States intelligence apparatus. This was not a mid-level analyst. This was not a policy staffer reading summaries. This was the man at the top of the system. And, before we go any further, you need to understand what that position actually means. Because most people hear counterterrorism official and think, okay, someone who tracks terrorist groups and monitors threats. That is a fraction of the picture. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center sits at the intersection of every major intelligence stream in the U.S. government. The CIA's human intelligence, the NSA's signals intelligence, the Defense Intelligence Agency's military assessments, the FBI's domestic counterterrorism reporting, all of it, every single stream, flowing directly to him. He does not receive a filtered version of the intelligence picture. He receives the full picture, unfiltered, in its complete classified form. The only person in America with broader intelligence access is the president himself. So when Joe Kent says something about a threat, or the absence of one, he is not giving an opinion. He is delivering a professional verdict based on the most complete view of reality available to any human being in the United States government. That is who just resigned. That is why this matters. On the morning of March 17, 2026, Kent did something no senior intelligence official in modern American history has done. He didn't resign quietly. He didn't send a private letter to his chain of command. He posted his resignation publicly, on X, for the entire world to read. And the letter said 4 words that detonated across Washington like a bomb. Iran posed no imminent threat. 4 words, 7 syllables. Read them again. Iran posed no imminent threat. This is not a political statement from an opposition senator. This is not an anti-war protester holding a sign outside the White House. This is the professional judgment of the man who ran America's counterterrorism apparatus. The man who read everything. And here is where it gets dangerous. Because those 4 words do not just challenge the narrative of this war. They challenge the legal and moral foundation of the entire operation. Under U.S. law and international law, the use of military force requires a credible imminent threat. That is not a technicality. That is the threshold that separates a war of defense from a war of choice. And the man whose entire job was to make that determination just said, under his own name, with full access to every classified file in the system, that the threshold was never met. But it doesn't stop there, because the resignation letter is not what the news coverage has reduced it to. It is not just, I disagree with the war. Every sentence in that letter is a precision strike against the official narrative. Kent wrote that he could not in good conscience support the ongoing war in Iran. He wrote that Iran posed no imminent threat to the United States. He wrote that the war was started due to, and these are his exact words, pressure from Israel and its powerful American lobby. He wrote that high-ranking Israeli officials and influential American media figures deployed a misinformation campaign that sowed pro-war sentiments. He wrote that this echo chamber was used to deceive the president into believing that Iran posed an imminent threat and that there was a clear path to a swift victory. And then he wrote the one sentence that no one in Washington wanted to see, written by someone with his access. He said it was the same tactic used to draw America into the disastrous Iraq War. There it is. The architects of this war have spent 3 weeks trying to prevent anyone from making that comparison in public, from a position of authority, with full access to the intelligence record. Not from an activist, not from a pundit, from the man who ran the National Counterterrorism Center. To understand why that comparison is so devastating, you have to understand what Iraq actually was. Not the war itself, the justification for it. In 2002 and 2003, the American public was told with absolute certainty that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction. They were told the threat was imminent, that the window to act was closing, that waiting meant mass casualties. A small group of senior officials invoked classified intelligence that the public couldn't examine. A foreign ally with a powerful interest in American military action supplied key portions of that intelligence base. And anyone who questioned it was dismissed as naive, weak, or unpatriotic. Then the war started, and the weapons of mass destruction were never found. The entire justification had collapsed. Now look at the Iran justification. A weapons program described with absolute certainty, an imminent timeline, a narrow window, senior officials invoking classified briefings the public cannot see, a foreign ally deeply involved in supplying the intelligence base, and an opposition dismissed as naive, weak, or, in Kent's case, anti-Semitic. The architecture is identical. And this is where the story stops being about Iran and starts being about something much bigger. Now, to understand where we are, you need to know how we got here. Go back to February 28th, 2026. That is the day the United States and Israel launched Operation Epic Fury. Nearly 900 strikes in the first 12 hours alone. Read that number. 900 strikes in 12 hours. The targets included Iranian air defenses, missile systems, military infrastructure, and Iranian government leadership. That last category is critical. The opening wave of strikes was specifically designed to kill Iran's supreme leader, Ali Khamenei, before he could go into hiding. It worked. Khamenei was killed on day one, along with dozens of senior Iranian officials. It was a leadership decapitation at a scale not seen since the opening hours of the Iraq War in 2003. The official justification from the Trump administration was immediate and consistent. Imminent threat. Iran was close to nuclear weapons capability. Iran was building missiles at a pace no one in the region could match. Iran was planning direct attacks on American personnel and installations. House Speaker Mike Johnson, briefed at the highest classification levels, stood before cameras and said that if Trump had waited, the result would have been mass American casualties. He said the classified briefings were clear. The evidence was undeniable. But here's where it gets dangerous. Because the man whose singular professional purpose was to assess exactly that kind of threat, the man who sat in those same briefing rooms, who read that same intelligence, came to the opposite conclusion. Not quietly, publicly, under his own name, at enormous personal cost. And he was not alone. Senator Mark Warner, the top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee, the senator with the deepest authorized access to intelligence community assessments in Congress, said the same thing in almost identical language. His words, "There was no credible evidence of an imminent threat from Iran that would justify rushing the United States into another war of choice in the Middle East. So now you have a fracture. Not a partisan fracture, a professional intelligence fracture. The administration says the intelligence was clear, the threat was real, the action was justified. The director of the National Counterterrorism Center says the opposite. The top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee says the opposite. Both had access to the classified record. Both reached the same conclusion independently. And here's what that means. Either the administration is right and two of the most credentialed intelligence voices in Washington are catastrophically wrong, or the justification for this war was shaped to support a decision that had already been made before the intelligence was fully weighed. There is no comfortable middle ground between those two possibilities. And what happened next surprised everyone. When Kent's letter went public, the administration's response was immediate. Trump called him weak on security, said he was not smart, said people who didn't see Iran as a threat were not savvy. The White House press secretary called the letter insulting and laughable. The former top Republican senator called Kent an anti-Semite. Now stop. Notice what every single one of those responses has in common. None of them engaged with the intelligence claim. Not one. None of them said, here's the specific evidence of the imminent threat that the director of the National Counterterrorism Center somehow failed to see. None of them produced a document, a timeline, or a sourced assertion that addressed the core factual question Kent's letter raised. They attacked his character. They questioned his loyalty. They questioned his intelligence. They did not answer his question. In a court of law, when the prosecution attacks the witness instead of the evidence, there is a reason for that. The evidence cannot withstand examination. Now look at where the war actually stands. 17 days after the first strikes, the United States has hit more than 5,000 Iranian targets. More than 50 Iranian ships have been damaged or destroyed. Iran's supreme leader is dead. NATO air defenses have shot down Iranian missiles over Turkish airspace twice. Fighting between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon has displaced nearly 700,000 people in a single week, 100,000 of them in a single day. And here's the moment that should stop you cold. President Trump, the same president who said the threat was imminent and overwhelming, is now signaling publicly that the war could be over soon, that many military objectives have already been achieved, that there may be an off-ramp available. Let that land. Imminent existential threat. 900 strikes in 12 hours. A supreme leader killed on day one, and 17 days later, it might almost be over. Think about what that timeline actually reveals. If Iran was genuinely on the verge of deploying nuclear weapons and planning mass casualty attacks on American cities, those objectives would not be resolved in 17 days of airstrikes. Existential threats do not dissolve in 17 days. They require sustained ground campaigns, long-term military presence, years of strategic restructuring. What gets resolved in 17 days of targeted airstrikes is not an existential threat. It is a degradation campaign, a precisely calibrated military operation designed to set back a program and demonstrate capability, not to destroy a nation teetering on the edge of nuclear deployment. The scale of the action and the speed of the claimed resolution are not consistent with the magnitude of the threat that was used to justify it. That gap is not a minor inconsistency. That gap is the question at the center of everything. But here's what most people are missing right now. The war isn't over, and the most dangerous chapter may not have started yet. The Strait of Hormuz is not just a body of water on a map. It is the passage through which roughly 20% of the entire world's oil supply moves every single day. Iran has pledged to maintain restrictions on it. President Trump has threatened to escalate if they do. Those two positions are not in negotiation right now. They are pointed directly at each other, and the distance between a military threat and its execution in a war that has already killed a supreme leader and struck 5,000 targets is not a comfortable distance. If that standoff escalates into a direct confrontation, the consequences travel far beyond the battlefield. Every country that imports oil, every supply chain that runs on energy, every household that buys food, fuel, or anything manufactured. The Strait of Hormuz is not a military problem. It is an economic pressure point with a global radius. And underneath all of this, underneath the strikes, the intelligence disputes, the contradicting timelines, and the unanswered questions, there is a human story that deserves more than a footnote. Joe Kent deployed to combat zones 11 times. His wife, Shannon Kent, was a Navy cryptologic technician and the mother of 2 children. On January 16, 2019, she was killed in a suicide bombing in Manbij, Syria. She was 35 years old. She was killed in a conflict that grew directly from the regional chaos unleashed by the Iraq War, the same war that Kent now names as the template for what is happening in Iran. He does not know the cost of manufactured wars from a briefing document. He knows it from a folded flag, from the specific, permanent daily reality of raising 2 children without their mother, from a house where her absence is not a policy question. It is the air in every room. When that man, from that history, with that access, writes that he cannot support sending the next generation off to fight and die in a war that serves no benefit to the American people, he is not performing outrage. He is not positioning for a political future. He is speaking from a place that no presidential rebuke, no accusation of anti-Semitism, no dismissal as weak or not smart can reach. And that is why this letter will outlast the news cycle. It will outlast the war. It will outlast every political career of every person who tried to dismiss it. Step back now and look at everything on the table. America's most senior counterterrorism official, the man with access to every intelligence stream in the government, says the war was not justified. The top Democrat on the Senate Intelligence Committee says the same. The administration's response has been to attack both men personally while never once engaging with the factual claim at the center of their arguments. The war sold as an existential emergency is now being described by the same president as potentially almost over 17 days later. The Strait of Hormuz is still under threat. Lebanon is burning. Iran says it is ready for a long war and has closed the door to diplomacy. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, there is a question that has not been answered. Not by a press conference, not by a classified briefing, not by a presidential rebuttal. It is the same question it was on the morning of March 17th, 2026, when a man who had deployed 11 times, who had buried his wife, who had read every classified document in the system, sat down at a desk and decided that silence was no longer something he could justify. Was the threat real? That question cannot be answered from open sources. It cannot be answered from press conferences or political statements or congressional testimony carefully managed by classification systems. It can only be answered by the full, unredacted release of the intelligence record, the assessments that were written, the ones that were revised, the conversations between American and Israeli officials in the weeks before February 28th, the specific claims, the specific evidence, and the specific gap, if there was one, between what the intelligence actually said and what was told to the public. Whether that record ever becomes public is not knowable today. Whether this moment is remembered as the vindication of decisive action or as the opening chapter of a reckoning, that is not knowable today either. What is knowable is this: a man who ran America's entire counterterrorism apparatus, read the intelligence, watched the war begin, thought about his wife, thought about the next generation, thought about Iraq, and decided that silence was no longer something he could afford. He wrote the letter. He posted it publicly. He walked away from everything he had built. And the question he left behind has no expiration date, no scheduled answer, no off-ramp. It will be there long after the missiles stop falling, long after the political cycles turn, long after every name in this story has faded from the daily news. Because it is not just a question about Iran. It is a question about how America decides to go to war, and whether the people who make that decision, when they look at the same intelligence, are ever truly seeing the same thing.